So this week, this session, we want to talk about open versus closed skills. So this is more relevant to the kind of discussions that we were talking about until last week. It's a continuation of that subject. And after we finish focusing on this, we will discuss the what we have on syllabus for this week as the psychology of training near transfer. So one question that I have from you now is, what do you think are the differences between these two types of tasks? So on one side, we have these that have certain shared features. And on the other, we have these that might also have certain similarities. Or what do you think? Yes.
My name is Victor. I want to say that one starts called and the other starts called because of how many people you're interacting with.
How many people you're interacting with? So which one you think the right one is more?
Yeah, I would want to say
Okay, so one difference. Yes?
My name is Alex Kendrick. The first I made is that the side on the left skills involving tools, and the side doesn't necessarily have.
Yes, so on the left, you can see those tools, like, for example, the computer programming tools are computer and anything that you can see here. Here is the airplane and all the stuff around, and here troubleshooting and all of its devices. But on the right, you can see that it's more like not hard tools, but more people. And they're not directly using tools on as much as on the left. Any other differences? Yes?
Also, the skills on the left are much more structured in how you go about doing it, and the tasks that we're actually doing, where the ones on the right have a lot more fluidity and kind of when people accomplish it.
Yes, that's a good response. On the left, usually the type of or steps that are needed to performance are usually rigid or structured. So people usually have to follow certain steps for doing certain things. But on the right, there are usually more than one way to do that. And people have different styles in performance. There is no like a single objective procedure to do that. So it's kind of people's style. So although you might define objectives here or performance criteria, but still it is not something that we would say there is just one way of doing that, or right or wrong way, or there are fixed steps in doing them. So yes, that was a good answer. Any other thought? Yes? Can you please repeat?
time spent on training to acquire these skills like on the left and on the right being different, and the division of subtasks, like for example, learning like how to fire thing versus presenting. They have different types of training and skills.
So which one do you think needs more time for training, left or right? Left one.
Yeah.
Okay. So left one needs more time on training. Probably the reason is because there is fixed ways of doing that. And so to follow those fixed ways or to learn those fixed ways, you need more time on training. But on the right, it's more like you should start by trial and error, or you should have someone as a supervisor and guiding you on how to do things. Yes, that might be a factor.
Michael, and I would say it's kind of opposite, because the fact that the left side has more fixed methods of training, and the right one is more open-ended, so there's multiple ways by trial and error, it's probably going to take more time to figure out what works for you. For example, like in discussion, like how you may have to go through multiple different steps to figure out what works for you.
So your friend is saying that it might be exactly the opposite. It might be that the right one needs more time because it's more complicated, or to reach a certain level of performance is more difficult to define. So it needs more training. That's the question. I mean, it's the time on which one needs more time. I would say it depends. It depends on the complexity of the task and the objectives and the level of performance that they want to reach, and their background knowledge and prior skill and all of that. So you might have simple tasks on either side, or complex tasks on either side that might take more time. But it's pointing to the nature of difference between these two sides. You had any?
I would say like the difference is, I think the task on the left, there's like a certain way of doing it. When it comes to the right, like let's say you're talking to people, you can, there's different ways to approach it. Same for wrestling, some people might be like so maybe but on like the left, there's like a certain way to fly an airplane. Maybe it's not like you can't really pull like your own style.
Yes. And your name?
Oh, Stanley.
So yes, it's relevant to what we discussed in a sense that you cannot really follow your style, for example, in flying an airplane. If you do, it might have fatal consequences. And it might be in certain types of flying, but usually there are, at least in training, there are fixed procedures to follow. And there are steps to do them. But in, say, lecturing or in managing or in wrestling, those procedures are highly individualized and is not like fixed steps to follow. Those are all good thoughts. And so an article by Yellen and Ford in 1999 just created this category of or dimensions of skills and defined these categories as open versus closed. So this is important to keep in mind, that closed skills, as you mentioned, have usually fixed procedures. Usually the trainees should follow fixed procedures. And usually there aren't much room for or freedom to follow their style or anything of that kind, because there are only one or a few ways of performing. But in open skills, you can just, there are numerous ways or infinite different ways of performance. You can have your own. And usually, if you think about the differences between these skills, you can see that, for example, a sports champion or Olympic medalist, they might be unique even in history of that sport. The performance might be unique, completely unique. So this is an important difference between these two open versus closed skills. So as you can see here, we saw these examples of, these are examples of closed skills. Usually they involve using tools and they follow certain fixed procedures. And here we can see the open skills of, say, managing a group, a professional sport like wrestling, and lecturing a class. So as you mentioned, again, closed skills often use tools. But open skills might or might not. And this makes sense because usually using tools for certain reasons, you should follow certain principles or order or procedure. So from the same article, Yellen and Ford, you can see here that the examples of closed skills, like auto mechanic, for example, change turn lights in a car. And there are like certain things that that person should follow. It's not a matter of style or anything. It's just simple steps and procedure to do that. Or if you just think about these, there is even counselor, that you might think of it as an open skill, but because this specific task is following certain principles and certain orders, it is here considered as closed skills. That there are certain things, advise a patient testing positive for AIDS, about contagion reporting and testing. So even that person is following certain orders, a certain procedure. But most of these involve tools, as you can see, like mechanic, manufacturer, airline representative. Most of these have some tool use, or they have a fixed procedure. But here for open skill, you can see that there is, most of these skills are what we have in mind for open skills, like police officer, artist, teacher, actor, professional sport like boxer. There are examples of open skills because of the reasons that we talked about. And if you're interested to learn more about that, I would definitely recommend reading that article because they have a lengthy discussion about this categorization. So one thing to keep in mind is that you might have recognized that there are no like certain specific conditions or sharp boundaries to say that this is an open and the other one is closed. Some tasks might be both or either. It depends on how you look at it, or it might be, for example, a counselor might be considered as closed, but the same counseling, if it is conducted in a different way, might be considered as open or closed. So another question that I have from you is, why should we care about whether a skill is closed or open? Yes? It affects how you train that skill. Yes. And can anyone say how it might affect? Yes?
And on it, and I guess it shows you or tells you kind of like what approach you need to get for that skill. So for example, with programming, you need to know when to practice the closed skills of programming. And then you also need to know when to practice open skills. And I mean that as like you're creating a program, specific steps you need to do. And if you're running into an issue, there's different ways you can work around it. And so in that scenario, we use like the open skills program.
Yes, again, because it might affect certain aspects of training that or the type of skills that is needed for, say, a job. Any other reason that we should, yes?
I think it was important to know because happens to different ways to evaluate the performance of the skill. And for example, like in fixing something, using a tool, if something works, then you know that, okay, like, you know, you're good at the skill. But then for like softer skills, I mean, the open ones, like public speaking, you have other criteria that you find like if this person's good at it.
So it's the performance criteria is essentially different in a sense that it's maybe more straightforward or easier to come up with a certain objective or task objective or performance criteria for, say, a troubleshooting task or closed skills, versus if you want to define a performance criteria for an open skill, it is more difficult because, say, evaluating a teacher, it is still possible, but it's not as straightforward as closed skills. Yes?
For answer, Daniel, the way I'm looking at it, it seems like open skills are like you get better at it the more experience you get. So identifying what's open and closed, like for closed, you can read a textbook or something, learn about it, and then it'll be pretty much the same. But for open skills, if you do that, you still need to experience it just to understand like what you're doing here.
Yes, it's a good point. That more experience is usually needed for open skills. If we think of real world open skills, which are slightly more complicated than certain closed skills, it needs more practice, more experience, and because it's not following the textbook procedures or fixed procedures. And another factor that I would also mention is that usually for open skills, there are supervision or supervisor assessing, maybe sometimes applying subjective judgment to judge whether that person is, to judge that person's performance in open skills. But for closed ones, you can self-check through a manual or some fixed procedure that's documented somewhere to see if you are following the right order or not. So yes, those are all good answers. In short, because it can influence training strategies. So if we know what category or what dimension of task we are dealing with, it makes it easier for us to refer to training strategies, whether to use supervisor or find fixed procedure from somewhere, and those strategies that we might use in training. So in this example, again, from the textbook, you can see that these are the differences in training strategies as examples. That for closed skills here, left side is closed, right side is open. And you can see that usually these strategies mention things like carefully specifying things or procedures, precise prescriptive procedural checklists. It's obvious that there can be checklists to do that. But if you see the right side, it's mostly like how to do things in certain conditions or putting people in certain situations and see their responses, reflecting on their application of their tasks. And it's a bit more complicated to come up with the strategies for training open skills. So this is what that article gave as example. Usually, I mean, if you just have like a abstract look on the differences, the left side is mostly on procedures, focusing on procedures, steps. The right side is on putting people in different situations and conditions and checking their performance. Or this is another example. The previous one was heavy supervision. This one is more autonomous, but still closed versus open skill. And you can see the same difference here between these two sides. Left side is more focused on precise steps, procedures, checklist, but the right side is again teaching trainees, for example, how to choose conditions or dynamic decision making. So it helps if we think about the difference between job and task, because most jobs especially in this current modern economy, most jobs need both types of skills. So if you think about most of the jobs that you have in mind, security analyst, computer programmer, anything that's related to even your background, it needs both of these types, both of these sets of skills or types of skills. It is because, for example, for the security analyst, it's both technical skills that are closed, and you need to have the ability or skill to present the result or to report to the manager or to negotiate something. Those are all the skills that you should have. Or for an engineering is the same. For armed forces, again, there are a lot of hard skills or closed skills that people should have, and soft skill or open skills as well. So most of the jobs that you can think of are constituted of tasks that are both. So in short, it's good to have these in mind as takeaway lessons. That training of closed skills is more straightforward. It's just focusing on established procedures, usually, at least. But open skills is more complicated because it should focus on, for example, putting trainees in different situations in their training, or providing examples of strategies, giving them feedback on their performance. And some of them might become subjective, that you have certain organization that says this instructor is a good instructor because of the criteria that we have. But the same instructor, for example, might be in a different institution or university, and that one might say, no, based on our criteria, this instructor is not a good instructor. So it's a bit organizational, subjective, and more difficult to come up with an objective set of criteria. And feedback is another point of difference, because for closed skills, usually there are references that you can refer to, whether you're doing it right or not. But for open skills, usually you need feedback from experts or from an external source. So, do you have any question about the difference between closed and open skills and whatever we talked about until now? Yes?
How would you test the performance on like an open skill, like public speaking? Is there a way to test the performance like that?
So yes, what we talked about is defining performance criteria for that. And usually it's not like a fixed thing or some established thing. It's usually like the feedback from more experienced people or a group of people, or just looking at the final results. If you think about sports, for example, whether that person can beat another person in wrestling, for example, or their records. So you should come up with more complicated set of strategies. Sometimes there are like multiple performance criteria to use, but it's usually not as straightforward and simple as closed skills. Yes? Any other question? Okay, so Now, this is the new topic that we want to talk about. So it's more about like the psychology or the background or theoretical discussions of training. And then each time we talked about psychological theories or psychological background, the next session we will talk about the application of those psychological theories. So for this one, we should start with reminding you of the concept of transfer, what we talked about before. So transfer of skills usually should happen in our training from the training environment to the target environment. So the skills that people attain in training or in training environment or training simulators or anything should be transferred to the target environment. So just as we discussed before, the important question or the main question or the prime question in the psychology of training is, what should we make trainees do, or what set of activities they should do, which is our job to come up with those strategies, to develop skills for them. And those skills should be transferable to the target environment. Those activities or what they should do is our concern. We should come up with something to tell them to do this or to improve your skill in these tasks so that these skills can be transferred to the target environment. And our goal is to try to answer this question. So usually there are two strategies for psychologists and training scientists to use tools. And this is, again, I'm focusing here on tools. It's not about the timing. It's not about other contextual factors. It's mostly the discussion revolves around using tools. And there are usually two strategies or two groups of this is also a debate whether we should take one side or the other. But one is for some group of people or for certain tasks, people usually use high fidelity materials or simulators or tools, which is, in other words, a belief in near transfer. And we will talk about what near transfer is. And the other one is using low fidelity materials or the belief in far transfer. So for now, just keep this division in mind, that for certain tasks, we should use one of these two, and there is still debate on, for some tasks, which one of these two to use. Now, we will talk about near transfer first, and after that, we will talk about far transfer. So near transfer. Now, one question that I have from you is like general question and like basic question. Suppose somebody comes up to you and tells you there's a task of flying an airplane. The question is, how would you train that? So suppose you have infinite amount of resource and you are tasked with coming up with a strategy of training flying an airplane. What would you do? The first step, or what would come to your mind as first thing? Yes.
Small foundations, the size of it, possibly training.
Foundations, and can you please like clarify that?
Banking angles, how it lands theoretically, you know, as opposed to they call it, so it's done, they pull up last second.
Sorry, I lost that. Yeah. So you mentioned like certain tasks or certain objectives or certain parts of performance that you should have, and telling them that these are the tasks or objectives or subtasks that that person should follow, or focusing on the goals in performance. Now, if you think about tools, like imagine you want to give them some tools to practice or develop motor skills or physical skills, what would you recommend or what would you design? Start with a low fidelity model. Yes. That's a good strategy based on what we talked about in class. Starting with low fidelity is a good strategy. But imagine you didn't have this background knowledge, or imagine you asked the same question from someone outside the class or one of your relatives. What do you expect that you would hear from them? Nothing. I mean, this is sorry. This is basic question, I know, but
Start with a smaller plane.
yes, good answer. Start with a small plane or simpler tools or simpler plane to do that. Yes. Yes, yeah, but it's usually what comes to people's mind because they would say, well, practice with a simpler thing. Yes.
Probably a really high fidelity, as close as possible. People will not kill themselves with anything like that.
Yes, usually what comes to people's mind is like start with a simulator, but usually a high fidelity simulator. And by high fidelity, they usually mean like something that looks like a computer game or something like that kind. So start with a simulation and then go to the real device or real airplane. Yes. So usually I would say what comes to people's mind is that start with a simulation or start with a simpler tool. And usually when you ask them, okay, what's the effective way of doing that? They focus on things that look like the target task or target tool. So if you want to train flying an airplane, usually it's expected for you to practice on something similar, or your training tool should be something that is similar in many aspects, or at least visually similar to a real airplane. So the conventional wisdom or the intuitive thing that comes to mind is that the training tools should be as similar as possible for it to be effective. As similar as possible to the target system or target environment. So just as that example that we talked about a few sessions ago, if you want to ride a heavy motorcycle or big motorcycle, it's a good idea to find something that is a bit smaller, but still similar to this, which is basically a high fidelity model of this, which is this one, instead of a bicycle that might be similar, but is far away from its weight and other characteristics. So between these two, one would say that this is a higher fidelity simulation of this, but this is a lower fidelity simulation of this. So the belief in near transfer is basically the distance between this system and this is near. There are a lot of identical elements between these two, which is much more than if you think about these two. So the more identical features or elements between the two systems is a better strategy to train. And that's usually the belief in near transfer. So the skills developed after using this can be easily transferred to this because the distance between these two systems is near, is not far. Or if you think about flying a fighter jet, you have a high fidelity simulation and you have a low fidelity simulation here. The belief in near transfer is that this one works better than this one. Now, we are not usually here assuming that the level of background knowledge of the trainees or anything of that kind, because as we talked about, if people don't have zero knowledge or experience, it's a better strategy to start with this one. But if we do not consider that, if we want to just use or choose one system, this belief in near transfer says this one is a better system to use for training. So behind this belief in near transfer, there are psychological theories or psychological investigations. And early in the history of psychology, a behavioral psychologist named Edward Thorndike came up with this theory of identical elements theory. Thorndike is an important figure in the history of psychology, modern psychology and behaviorism. And he believed he is among the prominent figures behind this belief in near transfer, both in training and in various other domains of applied psychology, like educational testing and a lot of other things. And this theory still is discussed today and is used, although it belongs to maybe around 100 years ago. But the identical elements or theory of identical elements is called something around this identical elements theory. And it basically says that if you have, if you want to come up with a training strategy, or if you want to use training tools, the more similar your training tools are to the target system and environment, the higher would be the rate of transfer. So it's basically the rate of transfer is a function of the level of similarity between the training tools and target tools. He called it identical elements. It's still a matter of debate what he meant by element, like is it physical elements, is psychological elements. But we assume usually in discussions, it is assumed that by elements, it's meant surface features or visual features or tangible features of simulation. So as we said, the more similar the environment of training and target would result in a higher rate for transfer. And we can think about it in like a 2D plane. If you think about like a learning curve, if this is, if x-axis is like anything like fidelity or similarity, of training, and target tools. Or in other words, fidelity. And here you have performance. Or transfer. This idea of identical elements theory would be like a linear relationship between these two. The higher we have the similarity of training and target environment, the more would be the performance or the transfer rate between the two. And this is an assumption of identical elements theory in terms of a learning curve or training curve. And there is still debate like in the effectiveness of this, because if you think about it, we'll discuss that later, but it would cost a lot for training if we always depend on high fidelity systems, and it may not always be as effective as we think it would. But for now, the question is, we talked about these elements, identical elements between the training and target. And we define these elements as visual things or tangible things or fidelity or visual similarity between the training and the target environment. Can you think about other factors or factors other than tools that we can think of to increase the fidelity of simulation, to increase the similarity of fidelity or the similarity of simulation to the target environment in factors other than physical, tangible aspects? Yes?
Maybe like more experts on.
If
More experts during training.
more
Like
experts,
if there are more people that know what they're doing during training.
if there are more experts during training. So you mean providing feedback?
Yeah.
Okay, yes. And if you think about other factors, like other aspects of the task, what would you? Yes?
Let's say other factors of tools, general sense.
Location. So we usually think of location, as we discussed before, as part of tools or as part of that, but you can also think about like factors that are not directly relevant to performance, but are like more contextual factors of location. Yes, it can be a factor. Yes.
Establishing scenarios that they have to use the skill break training. So like throwing complications for their training that they have to make decisions with, work with that.
Yes, like other aspects that are important in training but are not directly tools can be considered as other important factors. And I should remind you, please, to say your name before you participate so that Renee can record that.
My name is Alex. One factor I was thinking would be like emotional factors. For example, like in the case of military training, you would want to mimic the emotional factors of the environment, like
Yes.
to create a situation that would be scary as it would be on the battlefield.
Yes, things like stressors or emotional aspects or time constraints that might put people in stress or might influence their emotions in certain ways is also factors that are not directly related to tools, but can also be considered as elements of training that we can think about. Even in high fidelity simulations, we should think about these factors. And yes, all of those are good things to mention, but if we want to say that in short, there are other factors, including stressors, timing, for example, or in other words, more like general contextual factors. Incentives, whether the incentives of attaining goals or objectives is the same or at least similar between the training and the target environment. Threats, again, are those among like the general stressors or emotional factors that might be involved. So if we think about near transfer or identical elements theory, those elements or those shared elements do not necessarily have to be physical features or tangible features, but it can be things like more contextual, but still important, like timing, stress, emotions, and things like that. So if we want to have some takeaway lessons from identical elements theory and near transfer, it's a belief, it's an argument, it's a stance or method of training, and it basically asserts that fidelity and transfer are correlated, just as that shape is one that we have on the board. So it's basically the one-to-one relationship or linear relationship between fidelity and transfer or performance. And if we accept that, we should always aim for using high fidelity simulation or higher fidelity simulations in training. That should become the goal.